Our first presentation, and he's going to come to us remotely. Scott was going to be in town, but he's got to be in Austin today. Is going to do a presentation on, the view of the elections. And so let me give you a little background while we change over the technology to beam Scott in. What was it? Star Trek, beam me up, Scotty, right? So we're going to beam Scotty in for this. And I'm going to give you just his bio. We're happy to have, and again, this is the strength of our business partnerships. I can call Fidelity and say, we'd like to talk about elections. And they're like, we're on it. So that's a really, really great place that New Capital's in to be able to get that kind of response. Scott Orr is the Vice President of Government Relations and head of the Southern Regional Public Affairs for Fidelity Investments. He's responsible for all governmental relationships at the local, state, and federal levels for Fidelity regions west of New York and New Jersey, working closely with Fidelity's Washington-based team. He also oversees Fidelity's civic and community relations efforts, including volunteerism for its more than 8,000 Texas-based employees, and working with its strategic nonprofit partners and other philanthropic efforts. He speaks frequently to client groups. In Scott's original career with Fidelity, interestingly, he worked for 12 years as a portfolio manager and a money market group leader in the fixed income department, and they managed over $11 billion in mutual funds. And then between his time at Fidelity's portfolio manager and current role, he spent a decade serving as the CEO of 2 nonprofit organizations, 7 years as an elected public school board trustee. Scott is a CFA and earned a BBA degree in accounting from Abilene Christian and an MBA from Harvard. And do I get out of the way now and turn it over to Scott? Scott, thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Leonard. I appreciate it. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And I'm going to go ahead, just jump right in and share my screen so I can show some slides for you folks. Again, happy to be there. Sorry I cannot be there in person. But again, hopefully we'll be able to cover some good ground today. I'm going to, for about 20 minutes or so, kind of hit some highlights of the current status of sort of state of play in Washington, D.C. And then also maybe, hopefully leave some time for questions, Q&A about, what's on the upcoming midterm elections and what that looks like for control of Congress. So I'm going to jump right into this. Just to set the stage, we know that we have an evenly divided Congress, which is it was controlled by Democrats, but with very narrow margins. At 220 Democrats versus 212 Republicans, there's only about 5 seats that Speaker Pelosi can give up if she wants to get a bill passed, because the Republicans are traditionally very unified against most of the bills that the Democrats are trying to get passed. So Speaker Pelosi does an excellent job of really holding her caucus together, and it's not a homogenous caucus. We have more progressive groups, we have more moderate groups, in both parties, but especially in the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of credit you give to Speaker Pelosi for being able to get her caucus to hang together to get a lot of bills passed, especially those, a lot of those that don't ever get taken up by the Senate. But again, that is a very narrow margin, the smallest margin of majority for either party all the way back to World War II. So again, it's been a challenge. And again, it also creates a challenge because it only takes a slight shift in that balance in the midterm elections for Republicans to take back control there. On the House, of course, it's 50-50, exactly 50-50. This is the longest period of time that in U.S. history that we've had an evenly divided Senate. The last time it happened, people may not recall, but it was back in 2000, which was the Bush-Gore election. And of course, everyone thinks about, Bush Gore, you think about hanging chads in Florida and not being able to know for several weeks who the president was going to be. But people forget there was a 50-50 Senate back then too. And at that point, you had Vice President Cheney to break the tie, which is what made it nominally in Republicans' favor. About 5 months into it, back in that time frame, Senator Jeffords from Vermont switched parties. He got angry with the Republicans. He became an independent, and they started caucusing with the Democrats, and that flipped control back to the Democrats. So that did not happen this time. You have Majority Leader Schumer because you still have Vice President Harris there to break the tie. And there was a lot of speculation early on that perhaps a Joe Manchin or someone like that would flip parties, but that hasn't happened. And actually, what has been proven true is that Senator Manchin's had much more power as with the sort of the key swing vote as a Democrat than he would if he had joined and become just another Republican along with the others. So it's been a very interesting issue to follow, and we actually may end up with another 50-50 going forward. It'll be interesting to see when we cover that when it comes to the actual Senate races here in the midterm election. Just to touch on this issue, I think it's important to realize and think about this. This chart's interesting to me as a nerd. If you look at the bottom of that chart, each of those tick marks is a 2-year Congress. So going back to the beginning of the 20th century, there's long periods of time when it's all dark red, that's when Republicans had full control. When it's dark blue, that's when Democrats had complete control. And then the lighter blue and the lighter red is just when there was control of one body, but it wasn't, across the board. But there were periods of time in our history where we've had, one party in control for a long period of time, 10, 12, 20 years at different points in time. And if you look, basically from the Eisenhower years all the way up to President Clinton's first term, if you look at that bottom row, the Democrats had control that entire period, more than 40 years of time where they had control of the House. That seemed almost unfathomable in our current era. If you notice, as you get closer and closer to current times to the right of this chart, it gets a lot choppier, a lot more back and forth. At this point, it's very difficult for one party to hang on to both the White House, the House, and the Senate, and maintain that for more than 2 years at a time. So it's going to be interesting to see if that dark blue for President Biden that's in place right now will continue on to that next bar when we go through the elections. Again, that's what we're talking about today. But again, we were just in a period because of polarization, because we're a fairly evenly divided country, that it's very difficult for one party to hang on to that power for a significant period of time. Again, especially when the margins are so tight as they are this time around. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this chart, but this is sort of a listing of all the things when we started and looked at President Biden as he came into office, looked at the things that he had talked about on the campaign trail, and just sort of keeping a scorecard of what has happened. And he's done a good job. He got his cabinet affirmed, and a lot of the nominees on the judicial side, that's been happening at a blistering pace. They've been adding judges to the circuit courts at a very accelerated pace, even just with the 50-50 Senate. That's enough of the control they can get that done. Similarly to what President Trump and actually before that President Obama did. The presidents have realized they need to make hay while the sun shines, while they have a Senate that's in their favor, and get as many appointments as possible. A lot of executive orders went through. The 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan was a huge benefit early on for Democrats when they were able to pass that. And when you spend time speaking with Senator Manchin or Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who are the two most independent parts of the Democratic Senate, most independent members, they'll tell you that they didn't love this bill. They didn't like aspects of it, but they wanted to be committed to the president and show that the Democrats could come together and get a win. And they did that. And again, it was a huge bill, $1.9 trillion, which is one of the largest bills ever passed the House, about the U.S. Congress. They did get the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act passed, which Leonard mentioned early on. The Build Back Better did not get passed, again, which was the more controversial bill of those. When they split those two apart, Build Back Better is the one that failed. And the reason it failed is because Joe Manchin didn't like the size of the bill. The other side of that, Kyrsten Sinema didn't like that you were increasing taxes at a time when she felt the economy was faltering. Those two different reasons are why they had so much trouble getting that bill passed. And so it ultimately died. Of course, they did come along later this year, just a couple of months ago, and passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is really misnamed. It's more of a climate control, climate change type act, trying to kind of bring more renewable energy incentives. But that was, again, another success. And actually it was that success, and Joe Manchin sort of doing a last minute change flip to voting for it, that has really created a lot of rancor in the Senate right now. And again, a lot of what I'm talking to you about is based on our conversations directly with these members themselves. I always tell people at the beginning, I usually make this early in my presentation, I'm not Fox, I'm not MSNBC. I'm just trying to share with you the conversations we have directly with these members of Congress and what they say behind closed doors. But there are a lot of Republicans that are very upset with the fact that Joe Manchin sort of changed his mind on that bill, and it ended up passing. And really, when it comes back to it, it was a similar point that he made some concessions. Kyrsten Sinema also made some concessions, to vote for this bill, because once again, they could see the fact that they were going to lose control of the House and the Senate for sure if Congress could not show some level of progress there. So there are some elements of that had come from Build Back Better as far as the types of issues that they were trying to promote. But again, the idea was they needed to get something passed that would be able to do that. And again, there are some elements of revenue raising in there when it comes to a minimum corporate tax that helped pay for that. So I'm going to move on to one bill that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of rancor right now in the Senate. And this is one bill, unfortunately, that may be collateral damage. This is the type of bill that Fidelity has worked very closely on. We worked hard on with our partners, those, the other investment firms like New Capital that, have an interest in these things as well, because typically we focus on retirement savings and the markets and what we can do to make sure that legislation is going to advance that. And this was a bill of a sort of a package of improvements, Secure Act 2.0, that would be improvements to the retirement system and things like increasing the required minimum distribution age to 75, expanding the ability to do IRA catch-ups if you're over 50. A lot of issues around 401k plans of automatic enrollment and just ways that we can actually promote better retirement savings for folks. And really no one's against this. It passed 415 to 5. In the Senate, if it came to a vote, it would have 85, 90 senators voting in favor of it. But because it came and it's been sitting sort of over in the Senate for a while, it was making some progress over the summer, but that Inflation Reduction Act actually just sort of shut the door on this right now. And unfortunately, Republicans aren't playing ball, and there's just a lot of rancor in the Senate. And this is one of the things that it might pass in the lame duck session after the elections. It might get attached to another spending bill, but there's a good chance we're going to have to go back and attach this, start over the process in the new Congress, because, bills do not roll over into a new Congress. You have to go back to the House and start the process again with new players potentially as chairs of key committees like the Ways and Means Committee. So let's jump to talk about the issues that are really impacting the election right now. Of course, inflation is the highest it's been in 40 years. We know that. It's no secret. That's a very troubling time for Democrats. Typically, whether or not it's their fault, the party in power gets blamed when economic woes are happening. GDP is interesting. This came out today, right? So now, late breaking news that I haven't had the ability to update this chart, but, up until this morning, there was two negative periods of GDP, two negative quarters, which is traditionally how we define a recession. Even though they were just barely there were two negative quarters, which, again, a lot of Republicans or, again, a lot of commentators would say we are probably in a recession. However, today, third quarter GDP came out and it's up 2.6%. It's on a monthly basis, it's 0.6, but on an annual basis, it's up 2.6, which is a little bit higher than most people expected. So even though these last two quarters, I don't believe were revised upward, we now have a positive quarter that I guarantee you'll be hearing a lot today. I know that President Biden's doing a lot of activity in Pennsylvania, other states, and he's talking about the economy because he's trying to kind of shift focus to say that he believes he has some ideas for the economy, and he'll definitely be out there talking about the fact that he's had a positive quarter in GDP. I guarantee you that's going to be part of their discussion, because suddenly this is not the liability it could have been if we'd had a third quarter of negative GDP. Of course, the big issue right now, as we've been talking about, is Fed raising rates. Monetary policy, what does that mean? Is it going to drive us into recession? This is a chart. As an old money market guy, I'm a big interest rate watcher, and going back, to the 1950s, the Fed has raised rates 13 times. Only 3 of those times have they ended up in a soft landing. 10 times they've resulted in a recession. And so where are we on the current one? We don't know. I think signs still point to the fact that even with a good quarter here that's just passed, that we probably may be in recession sometime next year. Maybe that's one of the questions on your next poll. But that's one prediction. If I'm voting there, I predict we probably will see a recession next poll. Of course, at this point, it's not necessarily impacting the election because we don't know that yet. And again, the GDP number coming out today is a boon to the White House and the Democrats. But it's also one of the issues that will be focused on in the future. And again, higher interest rates in general don't necessarily give people a good feeling about what's happening currently. Again, the stock market's not helping. These two charts or these two lines, the gold is, if you index the S&P 500 for President Trump from his inauguration day, the blue is President Biden. It's not helpful for Biden that, we've actually in a negative territory from when he took office. All of the gains of his first year have been lost, in the latest bear market. So it is definitely a situation where there have been, the stock market's not the friend of the White House and the Democrats. But again, you're not hearing a lot about this overall. Big issue, of course, is his approval rating. It's not good. It's around the 42, 43% right now. It really started falling off. If you look at this chart, very stark contrast that from the Afghanistan withdrawal and how that was viewed by the public. That's the point when he started losing ground pretty seriously. And he never has really recovered. It bottomed out over the summer. He's had a little bit of a bounce back with some of the positives from, again, passing some of that legislation and other factors, but it's still at a point where typically presidents lose a lot of seats in the House. Their party does if their approval rating is this low. And what are people talking about? Again, what are people thinking about when they go to vote? And that is the big question here, because people would have said back in the spring there was going to be a huge red wave. Then over the summer, it kind of almost like a football game. I don't want to trivialize it, but if you think of it in football terms, the Republicans had a great first half and ran up the score. Third quarter kind of turned a little more toward the Democrats because suddenly you had the Dobbs decision by the Supreme Court at overturning Roe versus Wade. That energized a lot of Democrats and made people mad. You had all the shootings and the tragedies in Uvalde and in Highland Park, Illinois, et cetera, suddenly brought gun control back to the fore. Those are all issues that started energizing Democrats compared to where the Republicans were. This chart shows that still the major issue there, inflation, jobs, and the economy, those two are combined. Those are both good for Republicans when it comes down to it. As I said, even if it's not the Democrats' fault, the perception is that a new party would create some change there. Climate change, though, is the next one, and that is more of a Democratic issue. Then crime, public safety, probably more of a Republican issue. So as you can see, there's a lot of countervailing impacts here about what it really means and what truly is going to drive people to the polls. But the key is the fact that there seems to be strong enthusiasm by both parties now. That's what's very interesting about these charts right now. As you look at it, typically whoever has the enthusiasm advantage gains those seats. If you see back in 2006, Democrats had the advantage, they pick up 30 seats. In 2010, which was President Obama's first midterm, a lot of people were upset. You remember the Tea Party had just been energized. There was a huge Republican advantage. They pick up 63 seats. In the next term, it's 13 seats. Then for President Trump, of course, there was a lot of people who didn't like Trump, but didn't like the presidency. So it was a huge Democratic advantage. They picked up 40 seats. And so if you looked at this back in March, as I mentioned, the next bar there, 55 Republicans, 35 Democrats, that looked like this is going to be another huge wash, a red tsunami that was going to wipe out Democrats in the midterms. But that has come back together. And again, the fact that these events that happened over the summer, all that has kind of tightened it again. The only issue here now is we're in kind of the 2-minute drill of this football game. Again, not to trivialize, but just to sort of think of it in those terms. And the Republicans seem to be kind of pulling ahead again. They seem to have the ball and driving the field. And there's a new chart that just came out yesterday that showed that both parties had increased the enthusiasm, but the Republicans had widened that gap again. I think the good news about this is that both parties are energized, both parties are going to vote. And to me, that's good for democracy when you see people out voting. To me, it doesn't matter whether or not who you're voting for, why you're voting, but the mere fact that more people are going to the polls. We may have record turnout in this midterm, which again, overall is a good thing because it means that you've got the most people having their voice heard. But again, as I've mentioned, it's difficult for a party in power to maintain that power at that first midterm election. And of course, every president going back to Nixon lost seats. As I said, the Democrats can only lose 5 seats to lose the House. Again, the only one to buck that trend was George W. Bush in 2002, and that was about a year after 9/11. And of course, there was still a lot of hope and feeling and sort of rallying around the flag. And people forget, but President Bush's ratings at that time, approval ratings were up close to 70%. Again, almost heard of these days. So with President Biden's approval ratings very much closer to Obama and Trump, you look like there could be some pretty serious connotations there. So let's just kind of quickly hit, where is it that the Democrats are going to pick up their seats? in this election. I mean, so where Republicans going to pick up these seats that we're talking about. One of the factors that's in here is redistricting. As you know, we have the census, and then once the census happens, that information, and we find out which states grew and which states grew faster, which states either lost population or didn't grow as fast. So states like Texas gained 2 seats, Florida gains a seat, other states gained some seats, other states lost seats, like New York and California, for example. So the fact is, though, because who controls how the lines are drawn, the gerrymandering that happens in all state legislatures that control those lines being drawn, Republicans ended up on the whole with about 7 more seats that lean Republican, R+5 or greater, versus the Democrat seats of D+5 or greater. I'll say the only thing about this chart. So it shows that right there's a built-in advantage for Republicans to pick up seats in certain spots. On the negative side, to me, what it's also showing that we've had a huge decrease in these swing districts, those that are neither D+5 or R+5. Back in 1998, 160, the plurality of districts were swing districts. Now we're down to only 82. That's because these state legislators have realized when they wanted to redraw the lines, they make deeply red districts and deeply blue districts. That's the best way for them to keep control of the seats in their state for the next 10 years. And it's unfortunate because what that does is create extreme candidates on both ends. Because if you're not worried about the general election, if you just want to meet what your primary voters, who are again the most partisan typically on both the Democratic and Republican side, you end up with more partisan members. You end up with the middle of the road members not winning their primaries, and by the time you get to the general election, it's almost a done deal. So again, part of this leads to why we're polarized. Although also a lot of this shows why it may be a little more difficult for Republicans to pick up a huge number of seats. And again, I'm not going to this chart a lot, but this is kind of the sort of the look of why most experts believe that Republicans are going to pick up seats, enough seats to take back the majority in the House. The right side here, the lean GOP and the likely GOP. If you look at it, these are all the districts that the experts believe are going to be voting and be putting a Republican in place. And you see all these blue districts, there's 22 of them. And all these 22 are expected to flip from blue to red, partly because perhaps the incumbent did not run again, partly because of redistricting, other reasons, or partly because it's maybe more of a swing district. But again, there's 22 that are expected to switch from blue to red. There's only 1 seat that's expected to flip from red to blue on the left side of the chart. And then, of course, you have all the toss-ups here in the middle, the majority of which are also Democratic seats. So Democrats to hang on, they have to win all their lean, they're likely, win all the toss-ups, and then also pick off, a handful of these lean GOP seats. It's going to be difficult for them to hang on to it for that reason, as especially along with sort of seems to be the late breaking polls toward the Republicans. The Senate is the other big issue right here. I'm going to wrap up here and give people a chance to ask some questions, but this is really the one where it's 50-50. The 1/3 of the seats are up, as it happens every 2 years. And Republicans are defending more seats, although a lot of these are very red states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho. Not a lot of fears that Democrats pick up those seats, but these are the seats that are going to make the difference. On the right side of the Republicans, they're trying to defend their seats that may be vulnerable. On the left side here, or in the blue, are the Democrats that perhaps might be viewed as more vulnerable. And if you're a Republican, you're looking at those 4 Democrats, and you're hoping at least one of those gets picked off and becomes a Republican seat. Similarly, Democrats are looking at this list on the right side of the chart and hoping that one of those gets picked off so it becomes and flips from red to blue. And again, what could easily happen, honestly, is you might see Cortez Masto, for example, in Nevada, lose her seat. She's behind in the polls, not by a lot, but then consistently she has been behind those polls. So if that flips to Republican, Republicans take back the majority. However, if Dr. Oz loses to Fetterman in Pennsylvania, which again, we had a debate a couple of nights ago. It'll be interesting to see if that impacts any of the polling or what that looks like for John Fetterman's prospects. But right now, Oz has been behind in the polls to some degree. And so if that flips from blue to red, then suddenly we're back at 50-50 again. So again, we'll have to watch these. A lot of possibilities for both parties. There may be some surprises. There are a few senators not even on this list that seem to have tighter races. For example, like Mike Lee in Utah, Grassley in Iowa. Those are a little bit closer than they have been in the past. We'll see what happens. But again, this is the key there. So finally, what does all this mean? Why do we care? Why do we care who has the House, who has the Senate? really, if you look at these 4 boxes, these are kind of where you end up based on the different combinations. And basically, if you look at the top right, that's probably the most one of the most likely places where we may land. If you have the House flip to Republicans, but Senate is maintained by Democrats, what does that mean? It means judicial appointments continue. It means you still have your cabinet members and all of the different regulatory members that you can get confirmed. It means if there's an opening in the Supreme Court, you're able to fill that spot because you still have control of the Senate. It also means a lot of conservative bills will be passed in the House that go nowhere in the Senate. It also means there'll be a lot more gridlock, and virtually it's only going to be must-pass type of bills that get passed. No tax increase bills, though. Again, if you're worried about some of the revenue raisers that were in the Build Back Better plan last year about changing how you tax capital gains, or what it means for Roth IRAs, or what it means for estate tax, those are all things that are not going to be on the table because, again, Republicans are not going to do that. The key issue here is going to be numerous House investigations. They're going to pepper the White House constantly with all the things like Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, where the virus come from, what's Dr. Fauci been doing, what's the IRS up to, the border, fentanyl. Those are all things I don't want to trivialize, but those are things Republicans are going to use their pulpit to be able to talk about. They're going to put the administration on the defensive. And I guarantee, that January 6th commission will be forgotten on January 1st when it comes to Republicans, because that will no longer be in place. The other one that's likely to happen is that bottom left, which is full Republican control, House and Senate. There you have a more emboldened conservative majority. You might have, and not all my colleagues agree on this, but I believe that if President Biden is a one-term president, which I believe ultimately he's not going to run, I don't know that for certain, but most experts believe he truly won't run. He may say, hey, I want to do something across the aisle, kind of reach back to my, where my history has been, and maybe I can get something done on immigration, perhaps with a Republican-led Congress. We will see, but maybe there's a little bit of a hope for some of that. But again, judicial and key administrative confirmations slow dramatically, maybe even stop. I don't believe that they will confirm a Supreme Court nominee. If there's one next February, I feel pretty strongly that the Republicans will sit on that for 2 years and let that remain open. It worked for them last time with Merrick Garland, with President Obama. There's no constitutional requirement for them to do it. If there's not enough public demand, they'll have an 8-member court for a long period of time. May not come about, but it could. And then you may have multiple House and Senate hearings and investigations on both sides. And then again, I don't believe this is good for the country, but I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for impeachment hearings because they're already building the case for that. And you may see a lot of House members especially pushing for impeachment actions toward President Biden. Finally, one last thing I'm going to say on the full Democratic control, that's probably another box that has possibility for sure. Again, as we've said, it's going to be difficult for Democrats to keep the House. But what would be interesting is if they keep the House and they get 2 or 3 more seats in the Senate, enough seats to sort of offset the Manchin cinema effect, you might see them get rid of the filibuster. If they could win several of those Senate seats, that would be really when you'd have a huge change in policy, because the doors would open for a lot more to happen, a lot more things on that list that President Biden had on his list. That would result in more taxing increases, possibly different types of spending increases, and again a much more progressive agenda on numerous fronts. All right, so I'm going to stop there and see what questions folks might have, and we'll just go from there.
Scott, thanks very much. And there's going to be an echo in the room here. Just can't prevent it. We don't have a bunch of time to take questions from the audience. We've had some coming in remotely. May we get those to you after, and you could shoot us back and we'll get to our clients with answers on them. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Any questions you have, I'm happy to answer, specifically. And also this deck is available that, if you'd like to have your folks take a closer look at it, be happy to have people do that as well.
We'll make all this a fantastic presentation. Let me ask one question just to close it out. What impact on the markets would some of these more gridlocked or aggressive or virulent agendas have on financial markets?
Yeah, it's a good question. Of course, no one exactly knows because every election's different. But in general, markets like gridlock. If you look at the studies that show that, for one thing, seems as though the markets do equally well under both Republican and Democratic administrations. So whether you have a Republican in the White House or Democrat in the White House does not seem to make a difference looking over, many administrations over the years. So that's really not a deciding factor. But the markets do actually do quite a bit better by about 3 percentage points when there's divided Congress versus when either party has full control. So again, there's other factors that go into that, of course, the economy and recessions and all those sorts of things. But I do believe probably there might be some sort of a relief rally if it does become true. Not that I'm pulling for one side or the other, but if there is some level of division there, maybe a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, those would be things that I think the market would view favorably, because it just means that policy is going to be stable and people like stable policy. So again, a lot of that's already being priced in. However, too, again, the betting markets point to both the Republicans taking the House and Senate. So I think folks are already counting on that. But again, I think at this point, that would be a positive for the markets overall, at least in the short run. I think it's fear, if one party has too much control because of what can be done with that.
Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Have a great rest of your seminar.
Okay.
Looks like a great rundown.
Pretty good, huh?